Mr Dennis, Mr Richardson, thank you so much for your participation in this inquiry. Thank you again for your submission. I know the Australian Institute have participated a lot in the different activities of the Economics Committee, and we really appreciate that. I just wanted to, I know you've been quite strongly spoken on this matter in the past, so I might give you the opportunity to make a few opening remarks, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions coming from that.
Thank you, Senator, for the invitation, and congratulations to the committee for raising what I think are such important issues. I'll make a few statements and then my colleague David will, and we'd love to answer your questions. In 1991, Kerry Packer told the Senate that people who didn't believe, that people who thought that people shouldn't minimise their tax needed their head read. Well, what we heard yesterday was that that was good advice from Mr Packer. It is naive for us to assume that companies do anything other than spend an enormous amount of money creating corporate structures, buying legal advice, and in turn influencing the laws, as Senator Milne was saying before, to minimise the amount of tax they pay. We should not think for a minute that that is not at the top of the to-do list of some of the wealthiest companies in the world. And it is our role as citizens, and I would argue it's your role as our representatives in Parliament, to not just identify this problem, but to address it. Every $1 billion in tax that's not paid by Google or Apple is $1 billion that's not spent on science or caring for the disabled, or indeed it's $1 billion more on the bottom line. If we care about providing services, if we care about restoring the budget, then we should care about collecting a fair amount of revenue from enormous companies that have gone to great lengths to minimise the amount of tax they pay in Australia. Hopefully yesterday's evidence from some of these enormous companies kills off once and for all the neoliberal delusion that what is good for the individual is good for the country. What you heard yesterday was that companies have no interest in doing what's good for Australia. It is naive to think otherwise. What they made very clear yesterday was that it is their job to pay as little tax as they can. And it is our job to either collect as much from them as we think is fitting or to ignore the problem. And I hope in calling this inquiry, your intention is not just to draw attention to the problem, but develop solutions to fix it. I thought the greed and the self-interest on display yesterday was remarkable. I can't think of any other word to describe the pride with which these companies see their effectiveness in shirking the burden of tax. It's not a burden, it's actually the price we pay for a civilised society, and they've decided that somebody else should pay it. And those people paying it are Australian workers who, let's face it, if Australian individuals pretended that their income resided in Singapore so that they didn't pay income tax, would be hounded, or a welfare recipient who concealed their income through Singapore in order to claim welfare benefits in Australia, they would be derided by many of the same groups who say we have no choice but to accept that big business will do this to us. We do have a choice. We have many choices, and I hope we start making some better ones. So the testimony provided yesterday by Google and Apple and Microsoft and others provides a challenge for Australia.
For the world.
Well, and for the part that you're elected to represent, Australia, the challenge is, do you want to do something about this? And we will give you good ideas if you want to hear them about what we could do.
I'm here, I'm listening.
Great, because when we participate in wars on terror, when we participate in wars on drugs, when we participate in global ventures, we don't sit back and say, we will not participate until the world has solved these problems. We as Australians decide to enter big challenges when we want to. We don't sit back and say, we'll wait till the OECD figures out how to tackle an ice epidemic. We decide that we'll do something about it.
But we are in a global community.
We absolutely are, and that's where a lot of drugs come from. Okay, and what we do in our war on drugs is what we can here in Australia. That's what we do, and we participate internationally. It is obscene. It is obscene to suggest that we as a nation state do not have the power to do something about these problems if we see fit. Now, you're the representatives, I'm not.
But we are. Successive governments are in this space.
Well, you are failing. You heard that yesterday. You are failing dismally. And the question for us as a democracy is, do we want to tackle this problem? I hope you do.
Well, we're here to find a solution. So
And
this is
we're
your
here to
opportunity-
offer you something.
This is your opportunity
Mr.
to
Dennis
give
is
us the
okay.
solution.
So, Mr. Dennis, I know you were going to go, Mr. Richardson, but now that we're here, Mr. Richardson, if we can kind of continue on this, and we'll come back to you in a moment. Okay, so yesterday we heard about the scale of the problem. We were given evidence to that effect. Some of it, frankly, I think some of it was, I think there was some clear obfuscation going on. The fact that the CEO of Google claimed not to know how their global tax structure works in an elementary sense, which is part of every media story about the words Google and tax for the past 7 years. I mean, we're not talking about detailed tax arrangements. We're talking about basic, what is on, every news article about this matter.
Well, I think she was being truthful. She didn't.
No, not Google. I'm
didn't know.
saying Apple. I'm saying Apple CEO who didn't know what was happening with their own money and hadn't heard of a Dutch.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You
I
said
misspoke.
Google.
I
You
misspoke.
said-
I meant Apple.
Yeah.
When the Apple CEO said he didn't know what, double Irish Dutch sandwich was, which is a very basic tax arrangement theory. Put all that aside. We know the scale of the problem. I know you have a very strong view, and your submission makes a very strong view that something needs to happen. So let's go from the premise that preaching to the converted. What are some practical ideas that you would undertake now at a unilateral level? Now, we heard others have concerns about unilateral action. You don't, and your submission says you don't. What are the examples of what you would do?
Well, I think the clear example comes exactly to the heart of what you heard about yesterday. For technology companies, their major expense in many instances, if not a major expense, is the payments they make to other parts of their own company for services. Now, if I was the CEO of a large multi-billion-dollar company, minimising expenses is my job. If I ran a company that was trying to maximise profit, then paying as little as I can for services is my job. So when the CEO of the Australian arm of these companies suggests that they don't understand that their role is to actually maximise those expenses, because the more they pay their foreign subsidiary, the less tax they pay here, I find that impossible to comprehend. Usual business practice is to buy services
Do you think
and
they
products.
were implying, Mr. Dennis, that they were lying?
I don't know if they were lying. If they don't know, I don't know what their job is.
Okay.
Because the job of someone who oversees a large company is to minimise the price you pay for the quality inputs you need and to maximise the revenue you get from selling the things that you sell.
So what would you do to address that, Mr. Dennis?
Well, I don't, and David knows a lot about this. I'll turn to him. But in summary, our main suggestion to you is that we actually just treat these intra-company transfers as what they are, intra-company transfers, and in calculating the taxable profit in Australia, we simply ignore them. This will have no impact on total global profits of these companies. It will only impact where the profit is generated. So if Google Australia wants to send $1 billion to Google Ireland for services rendered, that's fine. They can send $1 billion to Google Ireland. But when we calculate their profit here in Australia, we don't have to treat that as an expense.
How do you distinguish between what the legitimate expenses are of intercompany transfers and not? I mean, there is some. I mean, give you an example. Sorry, the Apple example yesterday, right? This was the point that they made yesterday. That you get an iPad. It costs an X amount of money. They're buying it. They're selling it for Y amount, and their profit's the amount in between. Now, the allegation that's been levelled at them many times is they've inflated the cost of buying it here to minimise the profit and make the profit elsewhere. But there is a legitimate, is there not, or maybe explain to me, there is a legitimate transaction there which says they are purchasing a product, they have to pay for it.
That's right. And the question is whether all those prices are arm's length equivalents. And clearly that in this case we're looking at old-fashioned transfer pricing. Yep. The sort of stuff. This was really big, actually, when I first joined the research service in the Parliamentary Library in the late 70s. Transfer pricing, was really big, and now we read it's the same companies involved again. But getting back to Apple itself, I'd like to distinguish between that sort of buying and selling of commodities, in this case the actual machine, versus the licensing of the technology. Now, to me, Apple is an organic whole, and the idea that we give any respect to the notion that Apple is buying Apple technology from Apple and so Australia suffers, that's just mind-blowing. To think, I mean, imagine, we don't know exactly what it is that allows Apple to earn huge monopoly profits throughout the world. But whatever it is, Apple have come up with a way of attributing a lot of that to the Irish subsidiary, where there's no employment involved until a couple of years ago, apparently. But they're allowed to book profits there, and it's mainly to escape American tax. But nevertheless, it affects Australia too. Australia, the amount of tax avoided in Australia was probably small beer compared with what they can get away with.
Are you kind of saying, I mean, again, I understand I'm a layman here, so there's, I don't want to, get myself in a little hole, but isn't from what you're saying, you'd mean you're putting a value of 0 on the IP of Apple? No.
If Apple sold to Samsung, if it licensed its technology to Samsung, then sure, we can expect that that's a legitimate transaction, and we treat it with that respect.
So what you're saying is Apple Ireland and Apple Australia, in the proposal you're floating as for discussion, you're saying Apple Ireland and Apple Australia could not be treated the way Apple is treating Samsung, which is how they treat each other now. They're not, at the moment they treat each other like they're distinct companies, distinct entities. Yep. So the example you're giving between Apple and Samsung at the moment is as I understand, the same relation between, say, Apple Ireland and Apple Australia.
Yes.
And you're saying no, they're the same company, they should be treated like the same company.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm
And to give you to clarify, this at a global level, if we look at Apple as a nest of related entities, what we're proposing would have no impact at all on the global revenue or global expenditure of Apple. It would have no impact on the global. What it does, by saying that we should treat these intra-company transfers as not legitimate expenses, what it does is have a very significant impact on where the profit appears to be earned. But it would not diminish the total revenue of Google at all. It would not diminish the total, it wouldn't increase the total expenses of Google at all. But it would significantly alter the geographic allocation of those expenses.
But what would this do to our... I think it's an interesting idea, but... yeah, sure.
If I can just follow up on that, how you'd actually go about it. Now, in your submission, you talk about the whole point of a strong anti-avoidance provision is arm's length transaction and the interpretation of that. So are you suggesting that we could have a much stronger interpretation of an arm's length transaction for the purposes of tax avoidance under our tax law, and that the way to fix this would be through that particular mechanism? So if you could, what we're interested in here is specific recommendations of, I think it's absolutely clear what you're saying is that these are shonk arrangements which just transfer. Location is everything, and you maximise your expenses in the countries where you can, where you get the biggest rebates, and then you take your profits to where you pay the least tax, or none in the case of Bermuda. So how do we get around, what do we do in terms of tax law? You would have heard evidence before from KPMG, who are busy advising Treasury and on the laws that need to be written to facilitate their outcomes. So in terms of a very clear thing that we could do, can you just explain what you would do in relation to this issue of intellectual property, intangibles, all these kinds of transactions. What would we do in relation to this arm's length transactions? What would we need to do?
Look, David and I are both economists, not tax lawyers. My opinion on this is based more on the structure of what needs to be done than how it would be drafted. But to give you an analogy, the thin capitalisation rules that we were talking about in the previous hearing, they were pragmatic rules that were created to solve an analogous problem. Companies were loading up subsidiaries with huge amounts of debt in arbitrary locations to minimise tax. So all of the borrowing for some companies was occurring in some place. So in an attempt, and that's all it was, but in an attempt to fix that, we created a thin capitalisation regime that imposed some arbitrary thresholds where we said it's just not reasonable for you to suggest that you've put that much debt into this part of your company. Now, is that perfect? No. Did it help? Yes. So I think that the structure of attempting to solve this problem starts with the structure of how we've tried to solve these problems in the past. We need to be pragmatic about it. We need to say, well, if it's clear that companies are making massive intra-company transfers, we can come up with some statistical definitions of massive. We can come up with thresholds at which the rules change. We can come up with percentages at which the rules change. And we can shift the onus of proof when those thresholds are breached. Is that perfect? No. Will the tax accountants tell us it's adding complexity to the system? Yes. But that complexity is what pays their bills.
The problem I've got is that, as I think you may have been here, I'm not sure, with KPMG, that they put out a paper as soon as those rules came out, advising people as to how they could get around them by talking about the arm's length test and the worldwide gearing test being preferable, because how long is a piece of string? You'll tie up lawyers forever determining how arm's length is a transaction and so on. So I guess that is always the problem here. How do you define it tightly enough? And Chris Jordan, the Tax Commissioner, made that point yesterday, that what seems to be a straightforward case ends up with a barrage of a dozen QCs or whatever SCs, and you're tied up forever. It's really expensive. So we have to come up with something that doesn't land us up in those kinds of difficulties, but nevertheless actually gets us somewhere. And as to your issue of intangibles, one of the issues I raised yesterday was was News Corp's restructure, and the fact that they came up with $7 billion worth of intangibles that then enabled them to do their transfer back to their parent company and so on, and yet they seem to be able to get away with that.
Yeah.
Look, let's put this into perspective. When technology has changed, which it has rapidly over the last century, technological change isn't new. When technology has changed in the past, we changed the laws to catch up. Technological change has led to a massive change in the way we deal with privacy in Australia these days. The government's metadata laws are a direct response to the challenge that technological change imposes on our national security system. So in other spheres of government policy, we accept that as technology changes, the law has to change to catch up. Well, 100 years ago, intellectual property was a trivial element, I would argue, in tax and in economics. And today it's the main game. Yeah. Intellectual property is what Apple is. So now that we have companies that are primarily the owners of intellectual property, we need a tax system that can cope with that. And that tax system might need to be in some ways different. It might need to treat these technology companies differently. We might need to say if 80% of your revenue flows from the intellectual property you own, we're going to treat you differently.
So just to come back to the main objections, which you will have heard, if no doubt you've been following what people are saying. That the best way to deal with people offshoring their profits is to reduce company tax here, so that it's a beautiful thing, and no doubt the big four accounting firms will be advising in favour of lower corporate taxation. But also this issue that if we act unilaterally in the way that, let's assume we found a specific way of being able to deal with this, defining arm's length transactions or whatever, that somehow this would be a shocking thing and we can't behave unilaterally when the OECD is coming up with a global solution while in the same equivalence as waiting for Godot. But I'm just interested in your response to those two things. A, that if we maintain the corporate tax rate at 30 cents, will that encourage or try and do something that'll force people offshore? And then secondly, whether we, by acting unilaterally, we would somehow discourage companies from being here. I just wonder if you could respond to those two things.
Yeah. On the OECD argument first, the idea that we should wait for the rest of the world.
It's popular here with carbon and things.
Yeah, well,
Well, it is September. You know, that's what they're talking. So there is a finite. The world
Okay.
is heading towards a September discussion.
If we're really that concerned, then let's encourage the whole world to take on these notions that we ignore for tax purposes related company transactions where there's nothing tangible happening. Let's encourage the whole OECD to adopt a similar approach.
There's 37 OECD countries, major economies that drive the world. It's a reasonable amount to have at the table, I would have thought, Mr. Richardson.
Sure, but that's why things are so slow, and that's why the United States has been able to stir things up and slow it all down.
But it is a global world we operate in. We have to take the globe with us, and
Sure.
there is more endeavour than ever before, I would have thought. And,
Yep, but we're
and
not
successive governments have been experiencing that.
Yep. But we're not suggesting that if we ignore these sham transactions in Apple, that Apple's not going to employ people in Australia and sell us iPhones. We argue in the paper that the rate of company tax, that sort of thing, is not going to affect multinational behaviour at all significantly. It may change the way and their motivation for tax avoidance. But sorry, there was another line of questioning.
Yes, I was asking about should we wait for the OECD,
Yeah.
and the second one is what about people who say that the way to fix this is to lower the company tax rate so that we're competitive,
Yeah.
rather than take action unilaterally here, which will force, in their assessment, force companies overseas. What's your response to that?
Well, that's just giving up. Do we solve domestic violence by deregulating? Do we, there are good reasons why we want a good, solid corporate tax system. About 30% of Australia's national income is earned by the corporate sector, and we should expect them to pay a fair amount of tax on that. Crazy if they don't. And we let them get away with things. But the idea that you can counter tax avoidance and whatnot by lowering company tax rates, when most of the serious tax avoidance happens through places where the effective rate is zero, does that imply that we should go to zero?
And also, I don't think that's a very good approach. If we believe this tax competition stuff works as well as the industry says it does, which I don't, but if we did, so say we cut our taxes to Singapore's rate, well, what would Singapore do? They'd cut it lower. Like if what we heard from the advisors here before was that Singapore set out to have a lower tax rate in order specifically to attract this, then what would Singapore's response to us be lowering our tax rate to theirs? Well, presumably it would be to lower it further. Now, if I were a cynic, I might suggest that therefore people that want to pay a lot less tax would go around the world whispering in people's ears, you better lower your taxes to match theirs, and then go and whisper in someone else's ears, you better lower your tax a bit more so you're lower than them. Now, that's what's been going on for 30 years. It doesn't... Let's separate tax for a minute from economics. No one is suggesting that if Google paid more tax in Australia, that Australians wouldn't have access to Google's website. Let's be clear, right? The Google website will still be there, it will still be searchable. Implicit in what's being suggested is if we taxed Google more, Google wouldn't sell as many ads in Australia. Good.
Okay.
And I don't know
Can I just
that from an economic point of view, that we should be at all concerned about that.
I need to go to Chris.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
I just
further,
had just a couple of questions, just following up on your proposal in respect of intellectual property. And you've talked about the fairest approach would be to allocate profit associated with the region to which where the activity occurs and there's a legitimate. And my question is, to what extent does country by country reporting underpin that or make that possible, or is your proposal workable in the absence of that?
I think transparency is very, very important. I think it's fascinating that companies, and let's be clear, companies, not people, would claim a right to privacy. And I think it's even more interesting that companies that make so much money appropriating the private information of their customers, if you've ever clicked on the terms and agreement for an Apple product, you might know what I'm talking about. The idea that we should be concerned about the privacy of these companies is remarkable. So transparency is very important. Again, I think this inquiry has showed that the importance is politically and from a policy point of view very useful. And country by country reporting would be very helpful. That's why it'll presumably be fought tooth and nail, and presumably we'll be told that we shouldn't force them to declare things in Australia until everyone in the OECD's agreed. But that's not how the world works. The Senate and the House of Representatives can make their own terms and conditions. They're called laws. And just as customers of Apple are held to the terms and conditions that they sign up, well, I think a term and condition of operating in Australia should be full disclosure.
another important point to make is that, we heard KPMG talk about, international tax treaty system and, we don't want to put extra layers on top of that, arguments to that effect. But there's no treaty, as far as I'm aware, that has ever said that countries don't have the right to tackle tax avoidance. But getting back to the country reporting, while I think we can all agree that there would be benefits there, if we still allow Apple Australia to pay licence fees to Apple Island for Apple technology, that may be more transparent, but it doesn't really tackle the problem. That this is basically a sham transaction, and it surprises me actually that the United States is not more upset about it. The idea that they're losing revenue because Apple attributes all Apple's technology to Ireland.
Can I give you an example? Imagine a married couple in which one partner was a researcher and the other partner was primarily at home caring for kids. And imagine that the researcher decided that their partner knew a lot more about some things than they did. So they started buying intellectual property from their partner, who issued rather large invoices for the intellectual property that helped the researcher do their job. If I were to approach the Australian Tax Office with that proposal, I would be accused of income splitting and tax avoidance. Well, what these companies are doing is income splitting. Right? They're forming partnerships in low-tax countries who are sending them large invoices for intellectual property services rendered, and that allows them to do what the tax system prevents partners from doing. And if we want to solve that problem, we don't need to tackle global everything. We need to understand that a lot of what are being called expenses are not expenses. They are intra-company transfers. And if our tax office defines what an expense is, then our tax law can tackle this problem in part. This will not solve the global inequalities in our tax system, but it will help.
Okay. All right, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Mr. Dennis, thanks for your testimony here this morning.